The reason I have this assignment is because Dmitri didn't want it. How do you introduce a man who's more famous than almost anybody on the planet? It would be easier, I think, to introduce Bonaparte or maybe Jesus of Nazareth. Everything that's been said has been said. Whatever I'm at to add is peripheral. But if there's a niche for me, it's maybe the fact that I probably am the only one in this room who was first introduced to Dr. Kissinger in a small cell in a prison in North Vietnam. Through a static-filled small squawk box by a woman we called Hanoi Hannah. After the cessation of bombing in the summer of '68 by our president and the release of the pressure that we had on the North Vietnamese, morale was pretty low among that crowd, and belatedly we learned that there was a fellow of sterner stuff that had become the President of the United States, and even later we learned he had a really smart national security advisor. Now we got to know, I first heard the name from Hanoi Hannah, and in her level of denunciation, the vitriol with which she described what he was doing in Paris gave me the rising optimism that this guy must be really doing a good job for the United States. And when the B-52s came north in the Christmas bombing of '72, I knew that something good was bound to happen soon. Here's the special thing, and if it's different than every other introduction you've ever heard for Dr. Kissinger, it's this, and it's a personal one, and I don't make any apologies for that. You all know that the nation owes a great debt to Dr. Kissinger for a whole variety of reasons, which others introducers have told you about for years. Mine's personal. The president made the policy, but the guy that had to operate it, this is like somebody else assigns the target, but I'm the pilot and I got to go get it. Dr. Kissinger got an agreement in Paris that allowed people like me to come home with their dignity. Having achieved an agreement of a nation that had kept a commitment to keep South Vietnam a non-communist country with the promise of the financial and military support that it could defend itself in the future. And that made it possible for guys like me to think that what we had, the price we paid, was not for nothing. And when the Congress pulled the rug out from under the following year in a shameful chapter in American history, we all knew it wasn't because of Dr. Kissinger. So, sir, I am forever grateful to you. You know that. I think everybody else now knows that. And would you please come up here and
It's customary on an occasion like this to say that it's an honor and a pleasure to be on the stage with a man as distinguished as Henry Kissinger. In this case, as Henry Kissinger is said to have said, that has the extra added advantage of being true. I want to start, Henry, our conversation, if I could, by taking a couple of items out of the day's headlines and asking you to give us the benefit of your perspective, your experience in figuring out what do we do about this. Let's start with Iran. Do you believe that sanctions will make Iran give up its quest for a nuclear weapon? And if the answer to that is no, can you tell us then whether you think it's a wise policy to pursue sanctions?
Can I say two things before I answer the question? First of all, I want to thank Chuck for what he has said, because for all of us, and for in several administrations, Vietnam was a traumatic event. And the nature of our domestic debate, we are still suffering from today. And I want to thank you for identifying what the issue appeared to be to the Nixon administration. That we did not think we could abandon people who, in reliance of promises of a previous, different administration, had cast their faith with us. And we thought that as the people responsible for the defense of free people, that we could not simply jettison societies that we had encouraged because our domestic situation had become very complicated. And to leave with dignity and without abandoning allies was the principal goal. But secondly, I want to say how glad I am to see so many comrades of previous battles. And just to remind those who were not part of it, that despite all the disputes, we had a good time. We thought we were serving the country. We respected each other. And there was a principle that President Nixon occasionally used in private conversations, which was, you pay the same price for doing something halfway as for doing it completely. You might as well do it completely. And that is certainly something he tried to do, and which, in all the controversies, did not emerge as clearly as history will record it. So, thank you, Dimitri, for arranging this reunion. Now, to your question. I don't think these sanctions will achieve the objective. I'm glad that we managed to unite the 5 permanent members in a sanctions policy, and no doubt they will harass Iran to some extent. But if the objective is to induce Iran to give up the aspiration or even the pretense of a nuclear weapons program, I do not believe they will achieve that objective.
So what is it wise to pursue this policy then?
question is, what is this policy? What does one mean by this policy? A negotiation will succeed in a general way if either there are objectives that benefit the participants or there are consequences that the participants do not want to face, or a combination of both, which is usually the case. I can understand that sanctions are a part of a policy. I don't believe they can be the only policy. And I don't see the balancing of risks and benefits that would move Iran in the present constellation to do much more than waste time. And I do believe that we will face somewhere along the road the issue of where do we go from here? Do we increase pressure, or do we, in some elegant way, abandon the effort? I'm stating this in an academic way. I'm not saying that this should be done.
Which do you believe represents the greatest danger to the United States? A military strike to prevent Iran from getting the bomb, or Iran having the ability?
No, when I say increase the pressure, I don't mean that means a military strike, but there are certainly measures that one could take in the isolation of Iran that are more inclusive and more telling than the ones that are being talked about now, which are limited by the restraints that is put upon them by various countries whose support one needs, either to get the 5 votes or the 9 votes that the Security Council requires. I don't think American military action at this point is a course that I would now recommend. But we are facing in Iran, it's a comprehensive problem. It's not a problem of just Iranian nuclear weapons. It's the existence of a government that makes the overthrow or the humiliation of America, of the American presence in the region, a key part of its policy, and that it's bent on demonstrating that a certain kind of jihadist policy will enable it to combine memories of the Persian Empire with possibilities of uniting the Islamic world behind a jihadist vision. And so after one has said for years that something is unacceptable, one will have to come around to defining what one means by that word. But maybe one can hope, although I don't think it's likely, that Iran, looking at the situation, will draw different conclusions, or that there is a regime change in Iran. I do think that the Iranian regime is in great difficulty basis. But if we are concerned about the proliferation of nuclear weapons, the fact that a different regime has the nuclear weapons does not change the pattern fundamentally.
I suspect one of the countries that will be vital in organizing greater efforts will be Russia, and it's a subject we'll come back to perhaps toward the end of the conversation. The other headline of the day appeared in this morning's Washington Post and another newspaper whose name escapes me at the moment. And it reports that South Korea will today make public evidence that North Korean sub launched a torpedo at a South Korean vessel and inflicted casualties. Walk us through what the United States response should be immediately to this development, and then add on what the United States should do in terms of the longer-term problem that North Korea represents, particularly in terms of six-party talks or direct bilateral talks.
Let me make one general comment. When I'm asked tactical questions like what should we do tomorrow, if you don't like my answers, that doesn't mean that good answers don't exist. That one could imagine that one could elicit from the 14,000 people in the State Department and the 25,000 in the Pentagon, that if the top leadership says, I want to do something significant, they might even come up with a better answer than I could by myself. It's a theory. Just to show my fair-mindedness.
Will you give us the odds on that?
I would start, first of all, with convincing South Korea that we're behind them and that we are not going to push them into a more restrained policy than circumstances in any case will dictate. And I think a firm South Korean response is indicated, because there can be no point in it, in what the North Koreans did, except to demonstrate that they are the defenders of the Korean nation and that they are willing to take on the South Korean usurpers in their mind, and that when all is said and done, nobody will restrain them, not the Chinese, not we. So I wouldn't push the South Koreans beyond where they want to go, but this is a rather strong South Korean government. But there's a longer-term question, and that has two aspects to it in Korea. One is the nuclear thing. All the doubts one has about Iran. Here's a country, Iran is after all a country embedded into a region. North Korea is a country with next to no foreign trade, no resources. Nobody needs it particularly. So why, if the 5 members of the Security Council and the people participating in the 6-power talks, we all say it is unacceptable for a country that can't feed its population to have nuclear weapons, not to be able to bring this about is a demonstration of a certain weakness, of a considerable weakness in the international system. So North Korea, in that sense, is a challenge to it. And why? But one reason it is, one complication is that North Korea is, on the one hand, protected by its truculence, but on the other hand, by its weakness. That the surrounding countries fear, and especially China is concerned that the pressures to get nuclear weapons away from North Korea may overthrow the regime. And if the regime is overthrown, you then have a vacuum. I'm giving you the interpretation, into which all surrounding countries may rush, and it repeats the dilemmas that were involved when China intervened in the Korean War and we intervened in Korea. So the Korean problem has a geopolitical aspect that is hard to address because there's no forum in which that side of it can be really discussed. And as long as you discuss it in pure weapons terms, and as long as the Koreans make obnoxiousness of policy, so that it is very hard to bring them to settle the nuclear issue alone, and they have been masterful in dragging out the negotiations and selling the same thing to us 2 or 3 times. And after selling something, they sell the implementation. And in the process, in each phase, they go up another notch in the nuclear field, so that it's a terrible example for a proliferating world. So that, I think, is the complexity of the Korean issue, not the immediate issue.
This question of setting the example is an important one for the Obama administration in particular. It's spent a good bit of the first year in office trying engagement policies with both Iran and North Korea. Doesn't seem to have brought fruit in either instance. I wonder what you think. Well, go ahead.
I do not object. I do not criticize engagement policy in the sense that it was useful to go through a phase of demonstrating a willingness to arrive at a diplomatic solution, and also to use the engagement phase to convey to Iran a vision of the Middle East that leaves them a respected place, but not a dominant place. But the difficulty arises when engagement becomes an end in itself and not the framework with it, which we're trying to distill out of it. In Korea, we have this special aspect of the geographic location and the proximity to the great power centers. Since the Koreans don't feel that they have to even play at engagement, it's very difficult to go a very far distance down that road.
Let's go to Russia. Do you support the U.S.-Russia Strategic Arms Treaty? Do you support ratification of it by the Senate?
I have to testify on that next Tuesday. I'll kill the suspense.
Go for it.
Yes, I'll support it.
Do you see this treaty as having a role to play or clearing the way for the kind of global nuclear disarmament policies that you and George Shultz, Bill Perry, and Sam Nunn have been advocating?
It can be, well, it depends how you interpret what we've been advocating. What we've been advocating has had 2 parts. It has had some specific proposals, which can be discussed on their merits, and then it has had a sort of a vision of a world without nuclear weapons. And I have always made clear in my statement, including when I spoke at the Munich Security Conference, that I don't know how that this is a vision, this is not a policy. And how to get to 0 nuclear weapons is not a policy I consider now operational. It is a goal. So can it contribute to a step-by-step approach, each step of which is verifiable? Yes. Will it open a vision of the disappearance of all nuclear problems in a measurable time? No. And one should remember President Obama has repeatedly said he doesn't think it can be done cheap in his lifetime.
And finally, before we take questions from the audience, I wonder if you would talk a little bit in a more philosophical tone even about the nature of Vladimir Putin's Russia today and the role that U.S. policy has played in helping shape a country that has its share of relative freedoms compared to the Soviet Union, but still a lot of resentments, perhaps empire nostalgia. Go back to linkage, for example, and tell us what role you think, looking back historically, linkage played in bringing about the end of the Soviet Union, if any, and what are the lessons that the Obama administration can draw out of the experience of linkage for the kind of engagement, sanctions, mix of policies that it is undertaking with adversaries?
Because anytime you ask somebody who carried out a certain policy to explain its excellence, you can get only one answer. But let's say in the Nixon administration, and I would say in half of the Nixon administration, I would say the President and I believe that one should not permit issues to be isolated, to be treated in isolation. That the Soviet leaders had to understand that that events were related, and that you could not have relaxation in one area and aggressiveness in another. Now, I said in half of the administration because the regular diplomatic establishment likes to settle one issue at a time. And having said this, we try to link various approaches together so that we will try to be very tough on any step that seemed to be a challenge to the existing order that Berlin, but also we communicated with the Soviets rather fully about what our general perception was in international affairs, and we were willing to conduct wide-ranging negotiations with them, even while resisting what we took to be communist expansion, whether it was on European issues which were principally. Now, there's another point of view that says the only way you cut this, we cut this. The question really is, was it the Nixon approach or the Reagan approach that made the Soviets get to the point that there's absolutely no doubt that Reagan conducted a very effective policy. But there's also no doubt in my mind that it was what was started in the 70s that created the conditions that made it possible. Because most of the weapons that were implemented by the Reagan period were started in the Nixon period. But I'm not derogating from what was done by the Reagan period. I'm simply saying that it wasn't confrontation that did it. It was alone. So who made the bigger contribution? It's not a key issue, but the issue is where did it leave Russia? I must say, I never thought that the Soviet Union itself would disintegrate. I thought that satellite empire would disintegrate, but over a longer period than it did. I didn't think it would all happen in a five-year period. But the Soviet Union, after the collapse of its empire, found itself in a historically, for Russians, tragic situation. Here is a state that had defined its identity over the centuries by a gradual imperial expansion and identified its greatness with its performance on this basis. And then they started under Peter the Great after 200 years of suffering, sacrifice, exertion. So this was a huge psychological drama. Secondly, they found themselves in a world in which where previously Russian policy could expand in all directions, they now found themselves in a world in which the borders with Russia, with China, were a demographic nightmare. The borders with Islam were an ideological nightmare, and the borders with Europe were historically unprecedented. So I have always looked at Putin as somebody who tried to restore a sense of identity and pride, and how you conduct yourself in such a world. The Chinese can appeal to their people and say, if you work hard, you'll be the greatest people in the world, because they think they are the greatest people in the world. If you appeal to Russians, you're the greatest people in the world. So they say, well, our great strength is endurance. It isn't necessarily, and it's not domestic, it's so how to focus that remainder of Russia. So this has been, I think, the challenge that Putin faced. Now, of course, if we think that it is our duty to spread democracy everywhere, that is not acceptable. But I have always thought that we need some understanding of the special situation in which Russia finds itself, not permitted to rebuild its empire, obviously. But I don't think Russia, in fact, one of the points I would make about this strategic treaty is that it repeats the detailed negotiations of the 70s against a danger that doesn't exist in the same way. There's no conceivable possibility of a strategic nuclear war between Russia and the United States. So I'm supporting the treaty, but it is not the same event as it was in the 70s, when there was a real possibility that the two countries might go to war with each other, and when you could plausibly talk of a surprise attack as a conceivable option. I don't think that is an option, and therefore it's an important step, but not of the same significance.
Henry, thank you. We have about 10 minutes before Dr. Kissinger has to leave. If you would state your name and affiliation, we're happy to take questions now. Sir.
Fox News. Thank you, and author of a book about the Nixon presidency. Dr. Kissinger, thanks for your time and your insights today. The story has echoed through the literature of an exchange between you and President Nixon during his final hours in the White House, in which you sought to reassure him that history would view him more kindly than his contemporaries did, and in which supposedly President Nixon supposedly replied to you that that depends on who's writing the history. I know that you don't make a science necessarily of reading all the books, and there's hundreds of them about the Nixon era now and the Nixon presidency, but I wonder if at a broad glance, 40 years after the end of the Nixon presidency and some 20 years after Mr. Nixon's passing, you are prepared to make any preliminary judgments about how history is in fact treating President Nixon, whether if you see any trend in the literature, and of course we're all reminded of what I think it was Zhou Enlai said when you asked him about the French Revolution, and he said it's too soon to tell. But in any case, any thoughts you have about how history is in fact treating President Nixon?
No, I know you, most of you know, and certainly the Nixon people here know, that I didn't know Nixon when he appointed me. I had worked against Nixon for 12 years as the principal foreign policy advisor for Rockefeller. And And I mention that only to say that when in foreign policy, the only question that Nixon asked is what is in the national interest? And his contribution was that he looked at a foreign policy problem and tried to determine where are we going, where do we want to come out, and where can we reasonably expect the other side to come out. Now then you might conclude what the other side wanted is irreconcilable with us. Or you might conclude there is a way to narrow it. We like to think of foreign policy, we as a country, in terms of dramatic episodes. If one man comes along and sets a deadline, and Nixon had some sense that there was a historical evolution, that the process would never end, that for every problem you solve, you have another set of problems. And I think as time goes on, and especially when people stop being fascinated by telephone conversations and start reading the documents, because Nixon was a great reader. Nixon wanted 20-page documents, and so that you then, when journalists are willing to spend the time on that, so I think history will treat Nixon more kindly and put him into the same pattern of thinking as, say, Theodore Roosevelt. He is the president most similar to Nixon's approach to foreign policy.
In the back.
Yes, Bill Gertz with the Washington Times. My question is on China. There's much discussion today about what's been called the Beijing model or the Beijing consensus emerging and kind of supplanting the U.S. Democratic capitalist model. And critics are saying that this may be the result of not pressuring China enough to democratize or make political reforms. Would you comment on that?
Because of lack of pressure on China. I didn't hear the end of the question.
That because of a lack of pressure on China's communist government to democratize, that this Beijing model is emerging and supplanting U.S. model.
My views on this subject are not accepted by everyone in Washington. My view is the Chinese have the longest continued history of self-government of any nation in the world. In these 2,000 years of history, they've managed to survive without specific advice from the United States. So I'm fundamentally of the view that for us to think that we can shape the domestic evolution of a country, of the complexity of the history of China, I think it's presumptuous. I don't know how you would exercise pressures in a democratic direction. We could stand and should stand for human rights, and for that we can always stand. But the solution to China's role in the world will not be produced by American lectures on how that society can make itself democratic. It can be produced only by developing a common sense that we are now both living in a world which is unprecedented in terms of each of our histories, in which there are some global problems that need to be dealt with. And on that basis, we could come to a better understanding. But I don't think the Chinese are directly, in their own mind, competing with us. They are acting out their history. They want to be the Middle Kingdom, and they want to have a performance that entitles them to respect and consideration around the world. And if they wind up as the dominant country, it's partly our fault because we don't perform as well. That's our real challenge. I don't believe it is in our power to democratize China, but we couldn't even define exactly what we mean by that. But we do have a role in appealing on human rights considerations and abuses of that may be a fine distinction. But I think fundamentally our relationship with China will be determined by our ability to have a dialogue that is relevant to what is going on, to the global movement, and that would put us. There's no reason why, in the long run, at say climate conferences like Copenhagen, we should be in a confrontational position. This is something we should try to work out before. But in order to deal with China, one has to understand that they look at issues in a long-term strategic sense, while we tend to look at it in a very pragmatic sense. We think every problem has a solution. They think no problem has an ultimate solution because they've seen a lot in 2,000 years. So how to reconcile these approaches is one of the key challenges of our time.
Last question from the rear of the room.
Dan Dombey, Financial Times. Dr. Kissinger, as a kind of follow-on to that question, we've heard increasingly about rising powers, not just giants like India and China, but obviously other countries like Mexico, Turkey, Brazil, and Indonesia. What's your advice to the Obama administration on how best to conduct relations with those countries? I'm thinking in particular of Turkey and Brazil, given this week. Hillary Clinton spent a lot of this year telling Turkey and Brazil not to go to Tehran and negotiate with Tehran. They did a deal or some kind of agreement with Iran this week, and she seemed unhappy about that yesterday. The Security Council, the established powers, forged ahead with a resolution, with taking a resolution to the full council yesterday as well. What's the sensible way for the US to deal with these up-and-coming countries?
Well, I accept it likely that on issues of strategic impact around the world, countries like Brazil will try to put themselves between us and what the problem is. I don't expect Brazil to have the same intensity of feeling about the impact of nuclear proliferation at this stage of its evolution. On the other hand, I would hope we get to a position where Brazil, or countries of that group, don't feel that they need to oppose, that they recognize that there are some special problems of countries that have lived with it for a long time. In Latin America, the countries of Latin America and the United States have lived in a peculiar relationship in this sense. In almost every administration, if you look at the rhetoric of every administration from at least Kennedy on, there is an affirmation of the importance of the Western Hemisphere relationship. And in almost every administration, it's run into the ground. And I think one of the reasons is that up to now, Latin America has been sheltered from the consequences of international position. and having the privilege of conducting them in a sort of a vacuum dictated primarily by their domestic politics, which are often fluctuating. That is now ending, at least for Brazil, and to some extent for Mexico, and it will gradually spread to other countries. So I think one of the challenges for American policy now will be to involve Latin America not in a Western Hemisphere type of dialogue, but as countries that really play a role internationally, and not just in a Western Hemisphere context. But I have no specific advice on. I think I sort of expected that Brazil. I didn't expect it of Turkey, but I think that I'm not surprised that Brazil had taken the position it did on the Iranian issue. The question is, what position will they now take as this problem evolves?
I think it's appropriate. Our last question mentioned Hillary Clinton because we've been listening to the thoughts of the man who set the standards for all of his successors. Dr. Kissinger, thank you very much.
Well done.